Hello, I hope I'm audible today. There's always a worry that I have with the mic. In any case, what I'd like to do today, and this is a shoddy introduction because it's not very well put together, is to read out to you an essay by Walter Benjamin, the German literary critic and philosopher, titled The Task of the Translator. Sorry. I may be mistaking the name of the essay. Sorry, this is The Storyteller, Reflections on the Works of Nikolai Leskov. Uh, this is from his collection Illuminations, which I think was published in 1955. I'm not sure when precisely this essay itself was written because Benjamin, of course, famously doesn't survive the Second World War. He gets stuck on the Spanish border because I think there's some mishap with his passport papers. The uh, His courier doesn't get it across, or the papers are declared invalidated by the Spanish authorities under the Franco regime, being the particular circumstances. That aside, why do I pick up this essay? One, because it really does draw from what I would be able to identify as a Marxist as the two prime sources for stories that a modern society has to offer. One being, of course, agrarian stories, those in tune with seasonal cycles that describe the processes of uh, domesticity that farming and life in the fields and the country may entail, and the other, or rather, in a rapidly industrializing society, a society which hasn't already transitioned completely to industrial manufacture as its prime mode of production, the other being that of the tradesman, the traveling tradesman, or the merchant, which was perhaps prior to the establishment of the arcades, which were to later become shopping malls, were the people who vended their wares between cities, uh, and also perhaps set up small shops and things of that kind. Uh, Now, Benjamin, in his reading of Leskov, identifies these two strains and believes that it's important enough to highlight these tendencies as a way of sharing with his time what the life of people living there constituted of, concretely in actions which become memorable to people as experiences in their lives, because that's how something becomes shareable in a way that touches someone in terms of how and where they are situated. Like, this is something that Benjamin does think quite a lot about, as in what makes an experience shareable and how circumstances such as strife, violence, uh, war, and so on disrupt those processes via which a community, so to speak, stitches itself together. Now, I'm sure you would find a plethora of critical material on this particular essay, as well as Benjamin and Illuminations. But given that it has not been very easy to present readings in a public space such as a university these days, given the fact that a lot of these institutions have been shut down, and of course there has been all sorts of hiccups in terms of attendance policies and uh, appointments and things of that nature. I might as well use the medium that YouTube has provided us and see if we can present what was, and is to my mind at least, a seminal work for a new time and generation. With no further introduction, let me begin. The Storyteller, Reflections on the Works of Nikolai Leskov. Familiar though his name may be to us, the storyteller in his living immediacy is by no means a present force. He has already become something remote from us, and something that is getting even more distant. To present someone like Leskov as a storyteller does not mean bringing him closer to us, but rather increasing our distance from him. Viewed from a certain distance, the great, simple outlines which define the storyteller stand out in him, or rather, they become visible in him. Just as in a rock, a human head, or an animal's body may appear to an observer at the proper distance and angle of vision. This distance and this angle of vision are prescribed for us by an experience which we may have almost every day. It teaches us that the art of storytelling is coming to an end. Less and less frequently do we encounter people with the ability to tell a tale properly. More and more often, there is embarrassment all around when the wish to hear a story is expressed. It is as if something that seemed inalienable to us, the securest among our possessions, were taken from us. The ability to exchange experiences. One reason for this phenomena is obvious. Experience has fallen in value, and it looks as if it is continuing to fall into bottomlessness. Every glance at a newspaper demonstrates that it has reached a new low, that our picture not only of the external world but of the moral world as well, overnight has undergone changes which were never thought possible. With the First World War, a process began to become apparent which has not halted since then. Was it not noticeable at the end of the war that men returned from the battlefield grown silent, not richer, but poorer in communicable experience? What 10 years later was poured out in the flood of war books was anything but experience that goes from mouth to mouth. And there was nothing remarkable about that, for never has experience been contradicted more thoroughly than strategic experience by tactical warfare, economic experience by inflation, bodily experience by mechanical warfare, moral experience by those in power. A generation that had gone to school on a horse-drawn streetcar now stood under the open sky in a countryside in which nothing remained unchanged but the clouds. And beneath these clouds, in a field of force, of destructive torrents and explosions, was the tiny, fragile human body. Experience which is passed on from mouth to mouth is the source from which all storytellers have drawn. And amongst those who have written down the tales, it is the great ones whose written version differs least from the speech of the many nameless storytellers. Incidentally, among the last named, there are two groups which, to be sure, overlap in many ways. and the figure of the storyteller gets its full corporeality only for the one who can picture them both. When someone goes on a trip, he has something to tell about, goes the German saying, and people imagine the storyteller as someone who has come from afar. But they enjoy no less listening to the man who has stayed at home making an honest living and who knows the local tales and traditions. If one wants to picture these two groups through their archaic representatives, one is embodied in the resident tiller of the soil, and the other in the trading seaman. Indeed, each sphere of life has, as it were, produced its own tribe of storytellers. Each of these tribes preserves some of its characteristics centuries later. Thus, among 19th century German storytellers, writers like Hebel and Gotthelf stem from the first tribe, writers like Seichfield, Gerstacker from the second. With these tribes, however, as stated above, it is only a matter of basic types. The actual extension of the realm of storytelling in its full historical breadth is inconceivable without the most intimate interpenetration of these two archaic types. Such an interpenetration was achieved particularly by the Middle Ages in their trade structure. The resident master craftsman and the traveling journeyman worked together in the same rooms, and every master had been a traveling journeyman before he settled down in his hometown or somewhere else. If peasants and seamen were past masters of storytelling, the artisan class was its university. In it was combined the lore of faraway places, such as a much-travelled man brings home, with the lore of the past, as it best reveals itself to natives of a place. Leskov was at home in distant places, as well as distant times. He was a member of the Greek Orthodox Church, a man with genuine religious interests. But he was a no less sincere opponent of ecclesiastic bureaucracy. Since he was not able to get along any better with secular officialdom, the official positions he held were not of long duration. Of all of his posts, the one he held for a long time as Russian representative of a big English firm was presumably the most useful one for his writing. For this firm, he traveled through Russia, and these trips advanced his worldly wisdom as much as they did his knowledge of conditions in Russia. In this way, he had an opportunity of becoming acquainted with the organization of the sects in the country. This left its mark on his works of fiction. In the Russian legends, Leskov saw allies in his fight against orthodox bureaucracy. there are a number of his legendary tales whose focus is a righteous man. Seldom an ascetic, usually a simple, active man who becomes a saint apparently in the most natural way in the world. Mystical exaltation is not Leskov's forte, even though he occasionally liked to indulge in the miraculous. Even in piousness, he prefers to stick with a sturdy nature. He sees the prototype in the man who finds his way about the world without getting too deeply involved with it. He displayed a corresponding attitude in worldly matters. It is in keeping with this that he began to write late, at the age of 29. That was after his commercial travels. His first printed work was entitled Why Are Books Expensive in Kiev? A number of other writings about the working class, alcoholism, police doctors, and unemployed salesmen are precursors of his works of fiction. An orientation towards practical interests is characteristic of many born storytellers. More pronouncedly than in Leskov, this trait can be recognized, for example, in Gotthelf, who gave his peasants agricultural advice. It is found in Nodier, who concerned himself with the perils of gaslight, and Hebel, who slipped bits of scientific instruction for his readers into his Schatzkatsklein. I'm not sure if I'm pronouncing these German words right. Is in this line as well. All this points to the nature of every real story. It contains openly or covertly something useful. The usefulness may, in one case, consist in a moral, in another, in some practical advice, in a third, in a proverb or maxim. In every case, the storyteller is a man who has counsel for his readers. But if today having counsel is beginning to have an old-fashioned ring, this is because the communicability of experience is decreasing. In consequence, we have no counsel either for ourselves or for others. After all, counsel is less an answer to a question than a proposal concerning the continuation of a story which is just unfolding. To seek this counsel, one would first have to be able to tell the story. Quite apart from the fact that a man is receptive to counsel only to the extent that he allows his situation to speak. Counsel woven into the fabric of real life is wisdom. The art of storytelling is reaching its end because the epic side of truth, wisdom, is dying out. This, however, is a process that has been going on for a long time. And nothing would be more fatuous than to want to see in it merely a symptom of decay, let alone a modern symptom. Hey, let me just quickly check what fatuous means. I don't know what it means. 1 second. silly or pointless. It is rather only a concomitant symptom of the secular productive forces of history, a concomitant that has quite gradually removed narrative from the realm of living speech and at the same time is making it possible to see a new beauty in what is vanishing. The earliest symptom of a process whose end is the decline of storytelling is the rise of the novel at the beginning of modern times. What distinguishes the novel from the story and from the epic in the narrower sense is its essential dependence on the book. The dissemination of the novel became possible only with the invention of printing. What can be handed on orally, the wealth of the epic, is of a different kind from what constitutes the stock in trade of the novel. What differentiates the novel from all other forms of prose literature, the fairy tale, the legend, even the novella, is that it neither comes from oral tradition nor goes into it. This distinguishes it from storytelling in particular. The storyteller takes what he tells from experience, his own or that reported by others, and he in turn makes it the experience of those who are listening to his tale. The novelist has isolated himself. The birthplace of the novel is the solitary individual who is no longer able to express himself by giving examples of his most important concerns, is himself uncounseled and cannot counsel others. To write a novel means to carry the incommensurable to extremes in the representation of human life. In the midst of life's fullness, and through the representation of this fullness, the novel gives evidence of the profound perplexity of the living. Even the first great book of the genre, Don Quixote, teaches how the spiritual greatness, the boldness, the helpfulness of one of the noblest of men, Don Quixote, are completely devoid of counsel and do not contain the slightest scintilla of wisdom. If now and then, in the course of the centuries, efforts have been made, most effectively perhaps in Wilhelm Meister's Wanderjahr, to implant instruction in the novel, these attempts have always amounted to a modification of the novel form. The Bildungsroman, on the other hand, does not deviate in any way from the base structure of the novel. By integrating the social process with the development of a person, it bestows the most frangible justification on the order determining it. The legitimacy it provides stands in direct opposition to reality. Particularly in the Bildungsroman, it is this inadequacy that is actualized. One must imagine the transformation of epic forms occurring in rhythms comparable to those of the change that has come over the earth's surface in the course of thousands of centuries. Hardly any other form of human communication have taken shape more slowly, been lost more slowly. It took the novel, whose beginnings go back to antiquity, hundreds of years before it encountered in the evolving middle class those elements which were favorable to its flowering. With the appearance of these elements, storytelling began quite slowly to recede into the archaic. In many ways, it is true. It took hold of the new material, but it was not really determined by it. On the other hand, we recognize that with the full control of the middle class, which has the press as one of its most important instruments in fully developed capitalism, there emerges a form of communication which, no matter how far back its origin may lie, never before influenced the epic form in a decisive way. But now it does exert such an influence. And it turns out that in confronting storytelling as no less of a stranger than did the novel, but in a more menacing way, that it also brings about a crisis in the novel. Let me repeat this sentence. But now it does exert such an influence. And it turns out that in confronting storytelling, that it confronts storytelling as no less of a stranger than did the novel, but in a more menacing way. I think I lost this thread here. One second. With the appearance of these elements. Let me just begin from the stanza, if I may. One must imagine the transformation of epic forms occurring in rhythms comparable to those of the change that has come over the earth's surface in the course of thousands of centuries. Hardly any other form of human communication has taken shape more slowly, been lost more slowly. It took the novel, whose beginnings go back to antiquity, hundreds of years before it encountered in the evolving middle class those elements which were favorable to its flowering. With the appearance of these elements, storytelling began quite slowly to recede into the archaic. In many ways, it is true, it took hold of the new material, but it was not really determined by it. On the other hand, we recognize that with the full control of the middle class, which has the press as one of its most important instruments, is fully developed capitalism, there emerges a form of communication which, no matter how far back its origin may lie, never before influenced the epic form in a decisive way. But now it does exert such an influence. And it turns out that it confronts storytelling as no less of a stranger than did the novel, but in a more menacing way, and that it also brings about a crisis in the novel. This new form of communication is information. Villemessant, the founder of Le Figaro, characterized the nature of information in a famous formulation. To my readers, he used to say, an attic fire in the Latin Quarter is more important than a revolution in Madrid. This makes strikingly clear that it is no longer intelligence coming from afar, but the information which supplies a handle for what is nearest that gets the readiest hearing. The intelligence that came from afar, whether the spatial kind from foreign countries or the temporal kind of tradition, possessed an authority which gave it validity, even when it was not subject to verification. Information, however, lays claims to prompt verifiability. The prime requirement is that it appears understandable in itself. Often it is no more exact than the intelligence of earlier centuries was. But while the latter was inclined to borrow from the miraculous, it is indispensable for information to sound plausible. Because of this, it proves incompatible with the spirit of storytelling. If the art of storytelling has become rare, the dissemination of information has had a decisive share in this state of affairs. Every morning brings us the news of the globe, and yet we are poor in noteworthy stories. This is because no event any longer comes to us without already being shot through with explanation. In other words, by now almost nothing that happens benefits storytelling. Almost everything benefits information. Actually, it is half the art of storytelling to keep a story free from explanation as one reproduces it. Leskov is a master at this. Compare pieces like The Deception and The White Eagle. The most extraordinary things, marvelous things, are related with the greatest accuracy, but the psychological connection of the events is not forced on the reader. It is left up to him to interpret things the way he understands them, and thus the narrative achieves an amplitude that information lacks. Leskov was grounded in the classics. The first storyteller of the Greeks was Herodotus. In the 14th chapter of his third book of his histories, there is a story from which much can be learnt. It deals with the Sarmentius. When the Egyptian king, it deals with Sarmentius. Just need to adjust the camera and stuff. When the Egyptian king Sarmentius had been beaten and captured by the Persian king Cambyses, Cambyses was bent on humbling his prisoner. He gave orders to place Sarmentius on the road along which the Persian triumphal procession was to pass, and he further arranged that the prisoner should see his daughter pass by as a maid going to the well with her pitcher. While all the Egyptians were lamenting and bewailing this spectacle, Sarmentius stood alone, mute and motionless, his eyes fixed on the ground. And when presently he saw his son, who was being taken prisoner in the procession to be executed, he likewise remained unmoved. But when afterwards he recognized one of his servants, an old, impoverished man in the ranks of the prisoners, he beat his fist against his head and gave all the signs of deepest mourning. From this story, it may be seen what the nature of true storytelling is. The value of information does not survive the moment in which it was new. It lives only in that moment. it has to surrender to it completely and explain itself to it without losing any time. A story is different. It does not expend itself. It preserves and concentrates its strength and is capable of releasing it even after a long time. Thus Montaigne referred to the Egyptian king and asked himself why he mourned only when he caught sight of his servant. Montaigne answers, since he was already over full of grief, it took only the smallest increase for it to burst through its dams. Thus Montaigne. But one could also say the king is not moved by the fate of those of royal blood, for it is his own fate. Or we are moved by much on the stage that does not move us in real life. To the king, this servant is only an actor, or great grief is pent up and breaks forth only with relaxation. Seeing this servant was the relaxation. Herodotus offers no explanation. His report is the driest. That is why this story from ancient Egypt is still capable, after thousands of years, of arousing astonishment and thoughtfulness. It resembles the seeds of grain which have lain for centuries in the chambers of the pyramids, shut up airtight, and have retained their germinative power to this day. Let me get the page right. There is nothing that commends a story to memory more effectively than that chaste compactness which precludes psychological analysis. And the more natural the process by which the storyteller forgoes psychological shading, the greater becomes the story's claim to a place in the memory of the listener. The more completely it is integrated into his own experience, the greater will be his inclination to repeat it to someone else, someday, sooner or later. This process of assimilation, which takes place in depth, requires a state of relaxation, which is becoming rarer and rarer. If sleep is the apogee of physical relaxation, boredom is the apogee of mental relaxation. Boredom is the dream bird that hatches the egg of experience. A rustling in the leaves drives him away. His nestling places, the activities that are intimately associated with boredom, are already extinct in the cities and are declining in the country as well. With this, the gift for listening is lost, and the community of listeners disappears. For storytelling is always the art of repeating stories, and this art is lost when the stories are no longer retained. It is lost because there is no more weaving and spinning to go on while they are being listened to. The more self-forgetful the listener is, the more deeply is what he listens to impressed upon his memory. When the rhythm of work has seized him, he listens to the tales in such a way that the gift of retelling them comes to him all by itself. This, then, is the nature of the web in which the gift of storytelling is cradled. This is how, today, it is becoming unraveled at all its ends after being woven thousands of years ago in the ambience of the oldest forms of craftsmanship. The storytelling that thrives for a long time in the milieu of work, the rural, the maritime, and the urban, is itself an artisan form of communication. As it were, it does not aim to convey the pure essence of the thing, like information or a report. It sinks the thing into the life of the storyteller in order to bring it out of him again. The traces of the storyteller cling to the story, the way the handprint of the potter cling to the clay vessel. Storytellers tend to bring their story with a presentation of the circumstances in which they themselves have learnt what is to follow, unless they simply pass it off as their own experience. Leskov begins his deception with the description of a train trip on which he supposedly heard from a fellow passenger the events which he then goes on to relate. Or he thinks of Dostoevsky's funeral, where he sets his acquaintance with the heroine of his story apropos of the Kreutzer Sonata, or he evokes a gathering of a reading circle in which we are told the events that he reproduces for us in his Interesting Men. Thus, his tracks are frequently evident in his narrative, if not as those of the one who experienced it, then as those of the one who reports it. This craftsmanship, storytelling, was actually regarded as a craft by Leskov himself. Writing, he says in one of his letters, is to me no liberal art, but a craft. It cannot come as a surprise that he felt bonds with craftsmanship, but faced industrial technology as a stranger. Tolstoy, who must have understood this, occasionally touches this nerve of Leskov's storytelling talent when he calls him the first man who pointed out the inadequacy of economic progress. It is strange that Dostoevsky is so widely read, but I simply cannot comprehend why Leskov is not read. He is a truthful writer. In his artful and high-spirited story, The Steel Flea, which is midway between legend and farce, Leskov glorifies native craftsmanship through the silversmiths of Tula. Their masterpiece, The Steel Flea, is seen by Peter the Great and convinces him that the Russians need not be ashamed before the English. The intellectual picture of the atmosphere of craftsmanship from which the storyteller comes has perhaps never been stretched in such a significant way as by Paul Valery. He speaks of the perfect things in nature, flawless pearls, full-bodied, matured wines, truly developed creatures, and calls them the precious product of a long chain of cause similar to one another. The accumulation of such causes has its temporal limit only at perfection. This patient process of nature, Valery continues, was once imitated by men. Miniatures, ivory carving, elaborated to the point of greatest perfection. Stones that are perfect in polish and engraving, lacquer work or paintings in which a series of thin, transparent layers are placed one on top of the other. All these products of sustained, sacrificing effort are vanishing, and the time is past in which time did not matter. Modern man no longer works at what cannot be abbreviated. In point of fact, he has succeeded in abbreviating even storytelling. We have witnessed the evolution of the short story, which has removed itself from oral tradition and no longer permits that slow piling, one on top of the other, of thin, transparent layers, which constitute the most appropriate picture of the way in which the perfect narrative is revealed through the layers of a variety of retellings. Valery concludes his observation with this sentence: "It is almost as if the decline of the idea of eternity coincided with the increasing aversion to sustained effort. The idea of eternity has ever had its strongest source in death. If this idea declines, so we reason, the face of death must have changed. It turns out that this change is identical with the one that has diminished the communicability of experience to the same extent as the art of storytelling has declined." To repeat the sentence: if this idea declines, so we reason, the face of death must have changed. It turns out that this change is identical with the one that has diminished the communicability of experience to the same extent as the art of storytelling has declined. It has been observable for a number of centuries how in the general consciousness the thought of death has declined in omnipresence and vividness. In its last stages, this process is accelerated, and in the course of the 19th century, bourgeois society has, by means of hygienic and social, private and public institutions, realized a secondary effect which may have been its subconscious main purpose: to make it possible for people to avoid the sight of the dying. Dying was once a public process. In the life of the individual, and a most exemplary one, think of the medieval pictures in which the deathbed has turned into a throne towards which the people press through the wide open doors of the death house. In the course of modern times, dying has been pushed further and further out of the perceptual world of the living. There used to be no house, hardly a room in which someone had not once died. The Middle Ages also felt spatially what makes that inscription on a sundial of Ibiza, Ultima Multis, the last day for many, significant as the temper of the times. Today, people live in rooms that have never been touched by death, dry dwellers of eternity. And when their end approaches, they are stuffed away in sanatoria or hospitals by their heirs. It is, however, characteristic that not only a man's knowledge or wisdom, but above all his real life, and this is the stuff that stories are made of, first assumes transmissible form at the moment of his death. Just as a sequence of images is set in motion inside a man, and as his life comes to an end, unfolding the views of himself under which he has encountered himself without being aware of it, suddenly in his expressions and looks, the unforgettable emerges and imparts to everything that concerned him that authority which even the poorest wretch in dying possesses for the living around him. This authority is at the very source of the story. Death is the sanction of everything that the storyteller can tell. He has borrowed his authority from death. In other words, it is natural history to which his stories refer back. This is expressed in exemplary form in one of the most beautiful stories we have by the incomparable Johann Peter Hebel. It is found in Schatzkanzleien die Rheinischen Hausfreundes, is entitled Unexpected Reunion, and begins with the betrothal of a young lad who works in the mines of Falun. On the eve of his wedding, he dies a miner's death at the bottom of his tunnel. His bride keeps faith with him after his death, and she lives long enough to become a wizened old woman. One day a body is brought up from the abandoned tunnel, which, saturated with iron vitriol, has escaped decay, and she recognizes her betrothed. After this reunion, she too is called away by death. When Hebel, in the course of this story, was confronted with the necessity of making this long period of years graphic, he did so in the following sentences. In the meantime, the city of Lisbon was destroyed by an earthquake, and the 7 Years' War came and went, and Emperor Francis I died, and the Jesuit order was abolished, and Poland was partitioned, and Empress Maria Theresa died, and Struensee was executed. America became independent, and the united French and Spanish forces were unable to capture Gibraltar. The Turks locked up General Stein in the Veterenever cave in Hungary, and Emperor Joseph died also. King Gustavus of Sweden conquered Russian Finland, and the French Revolution and the Long War began. And Emperor Leopold II went to his grave too. Napoleon captured Prussia, and The English bombarded Copenhagen, and the peasants sowed and harvested. The millers ground, the smiths hammered, the miners dug for veins of ore in their underground workshops. But when in 1809 the miners at Falun, ellipsis, end of quotes. Never has a storyteller embedded his report deeper in natural history than Hebel manages to do in this chronology. Read it carefully. Death appears in it with the same regularity as the reaper does in the procession that pass around the cathedral clock at noon. Any explanation of a given epic form is concerned with the relationship of this form to historiography. In fact, one may go even further and raise the question of whether historiography does not constitute the common ground of all forms of the epic. Then, written history would be in the same relationship to the epic forms as white light is to the colors of the spectrum. Worth recalling here. Any examination of a given epic form is concerned with the relationship of this form to historiography. In fact, one may go even further and raise the question whether historiography does not constitute the common ground of all forms of the epic. Then, written history would be in the same relationship to the epic form as white light is to the colors of the spectrum. However, this may be, among all forms of the epic, there is not one whose incidence in the pure, colorless light of written history is more certain than the chronicle. And in the broad spectrum of the chronicle, the ways in which a story can be told are graduated, like shadings of one and the same color. The chronicler is the history teller. If we think back to the passage from Hebel, which has the tone of a chronicle throughout, it will take no effort to gauge the difference between the writer of history, the historian, and the teller of it, the chronicler. The historian is bound to explain in one way or another the happenings with which he deals. Under no circumstances can he content himself with displaying them as models of the course of the world. But this is precisely what the chronicler does, especially in his classical representatives, the chroniclers of the Middle Ages, the precursors of the historians of today. By basing their historical tales on a divine plan of salvation, an inscrutable one, they have, from the very start, lifted the burden of demonstrable explanation from their own shoulders. Its place is taken by interpretation, which is not concerned with an accurate concatenation of definite events, but with the way these are embedded in the great inscrutable course of the world. Whether this course is eschatologically determined or is a natural one makes no difference. In the storyteller, the chronicler is preserved in changed form, secularized as it were. Leskov is among those whose work displays this with particular clarity. Both the chronicler, with his eschatological orientation, and the storyteller, with his profane outlook, are so represented in his works that in a number of his stories, it can hardly be decided whether the web in which they appear is the golden fabric of a religious view of the course of things or the multicolored fabric of a worldly view. Consider the story The Alexandrite, which transports the reader into that old time when the stones in the womb of the earth and the planets at celestial heights were still concerned with the fate of men, and not today when both in the heavens and beneath the earth everything has grown indifferent to the fates of the sons of men, and no voice speaks to them from anywhere, let alone does their bidding. None of the undiscovered planets play any part in the horoscope anymore, and there are a lot of new stones, all measured and weighed and examined for their specific weight and their density, but they no longer proclaim anything to us, nor do they bring us any benefit. Their time for speaking with men is past. As is evident, it is hardly possible unambiguously to characterize the course of the world that is illustrated in this story of Leskov's. I had to turn the page, just to repeat the sentence. As is evident, it is hardly possible unambiguously to characterize the course of the world that is illustrated in this story of Leskov's. It is determined eschatologically. Is it determined eschatologically or naturalistically? The only certain thing is that in its very nature, it is by definition outside of all real historical categories. Leskov tells us that the epoch in which man could believe himself to be in harmony with nature has expired. Schiller called this epoch in the history of the world the period of naive poetry. The storyteller keeps faith with it, and his eyes do not stray from that dial in front of which there moves the procession of creatures of which, depending on circumstances, death is either the leader or the last wretched straggler. It has seldom been realized that the listener's naive relationship to the storyteller is controlled by his interests in retaining what he is told. The cardinal point for the unaffected listener is to assure himself of the possibility of reproducing the story. Memory is the epic faculty par excellence. Only by virtue of a comprehensive memory can epic writing absorb the course of events on the one hand, and with the passing of these, make its peace with the power of death on the other. It is not surprising that to a simple man of the people, such as Leskov once invented, the Tsar, the head of the sphere in which his stories take place, has the most encyclopedic memory at his command. Our emperor, he says, and his entire family have indeed a most astonishing memory. Mnemosyne, the rememberer, was the muse of the epic art among the Greeks. This name takes the observer back to a parting in the ways in world history. For if the record kept by memory, historiography, constitutes the creative matrix of the various epic forms, as great prose, in the creative matrix of various metrical forms. Its oldest form, the epic, by virtue of being a kind of common denominator, includes the story and the novel. When in the course of centuries the novel began to emerge from the womb of the epic, it turned out that in the novel the element of the epic mind that is derived from the muse, that is, memory, manifests itself in a form quite different from the way it manifests itself in the story. Memory creates the chain of tradition which passes a happening on from generation to generation. It is the muse-derived element of the epic art in a broader sense and encompasses its varieties. In the first place among these is the one practiced by the storyteller. It starts the web which all stories together form in the end. One ties on to the next, as the great storytellers, particularly the Oriental ones, have always readily shown. In each of them there is a Scheherazade who thinks of a fresh story whenever her tale comes to a stop. This is epic remembrance and the muse-inspired element of the narrative. But this should be set against another principle, also a muse-derived element, in a narrower sense, which is an element of the novel in its earliest form, that is, in the epic, lies concealed, still undifferentiated from the similarly derived element of the story. It can, at any rate, occasionally be divined in the epics, particularly at moments of solemnity in the Homeric epics, as in the invocation to the muse at their beginning. What announces itself in these passages is the perpetuating remembrance of the novelist as contrasted with the short-lived reminiscence of the storyteller. The first is dedicated to one hero, one Odyssey, one battle. The second to many different occurrences. It is, in other words, remembrance, which, as the muse-derived element of the novel, is added to reminiscence. The corresponding element of the story, the unity of their origin in memory, having disappeared with the decline of the epic. No one, Pascal once said, dies so poor that he does not leave something behind. Surely it is the same with memories too, although these do not always find an heir. The novelist takes charge of this bequest, and seldom without profound melancholy. For what Arnold Bennett says about a dead woman in one of his novels, that she had almost nothing in the way of real life, is usually true of the sum total of the estate which the novelist administers. Regarding this aspect of the matter, we owe the most important elucidation to Georg Lukács, who sees in the novel the form of transcendental homelessness. According to Lukács, the novel is at the same time the only art form which includes time among its constitutive principles. Time, he says in his theory of the novel, can become constitutive only when connection with the transcendental home has been lost. Only in the novel are meaning and life, and thus the essential and the temporal, separated. One can almost say that the whole inner action of a novel is nothing else but a struggle against the power of time. And from this arise the genuinely epic experiences of time, hope, and memory. Only in the novel does there occur a creative memory which transfixes the object and transforms it. The duality of inwardness and outside world can here be overcome for the subject only when he sees the unity of his entire life out of the past life stream which is compressed in memory. The insight which grasps this unity becomes the divinatory intuitive grasping of the unattained and therefore inexpressible meaning of life. End of quote. The meaning of life is really the center about which the novel moves. But the quest for it is no more than the initial expression of perplexity with which its reader sees himself living this written life. Well, just to let you know, I hope I'm not having some trouble with the data storage capacities of my camera. I noticed that the cursor is stuck in the spinning mode. I shall temporarily pause this video and see whether it's possible to go on and resume.